Evelyn Rowe had long stopped expecting more from life. At 58, she had built her empire from scratch, forged her company into a household name, and made deals that most men half her age couldn't even dream of negotiating. She was known for her sharp mind, her unrelenting work ethic, and the kind of composure that commanded respect and a little fear in anyone who stepped into her office. Yet behind the carefully curated exterior of control, luxury, and accomplishment, there was a part of Evelyn that had been quiet for years, a part that craved attention, warmth, and touch. But she had learned long ago to suppress that craving, bury it under contracts, spreadsheets, and the hum of fluorescent office lights. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. The day Lucas Whitman arrived at Rowe Enterprises, Evelyn didn't expect to notice him. She didn't expect to feel a flicker of interest, or to have her attention drawn so insistently to someone who was, by all measures, far too young to matter. Lucas was 26, fresh out of college, with a polished resume and an internship that placed him directly under Evelyn's oversight. He wasn't the kind of man she usually allowed into her inner orbit. Yet from the moment he stepped into her office for orientation, there was something in the way he looked at her that made her pulse skip. Not desire, she would not confuse herself so quickly, but curiosity, a flicker of intrigue she hadn't felt in decades. Lucas had prepared for the interview meticulously. He had researched Evelyn's career, memorized her achievements, and learned everything he could about the company's culture. But as soon as he met her, he realized it wasn't about credentials or corporate knowledge. Evelyn carried herself with a presence that made him want to stand straighter, speak clearer, and listen harder. And that was exactly what happened. He answered her questions thoughtfully, nodded at her directions, and smiled when it felt natural, not rehearsed. Evelyn studied him quietly, leaning back in her chair with the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. He was young. Handsome, yes, but it was more than that. He had an ease about him, a confidence that didn't scream arrogance. He didn't fumble over words. He didn't flinch at her reputation, and in a strange, inconvenient way that unsettled her. The first week was uneventful, strictly professional. Lucas shadowed Evelyn in meetings, learned the intricacies of the company, and occasionally offered insights that were surprisingly sharp for his age. He paid attention, not just to the numbers but to her preferences. He remembered her telling the receptionist once, casually, that she loved dark chocolate with almonds and a specific type of peonies in her office. It was minor information, a fleeting comment, but he noted it. The second week, Lucas left a small bouquet of white peonies on her desk, accompanied by a box of her favorite chocolate, wrapped neatly with a simple ribbon. Evelyn found the gesture absurd, almost childish, and initially bristled. "I don't appreciate this," she muttered, her voice clipped, keeping her back to him as she arranged the flowers in a vase. She didn't want to look at him. She didn't want to see his expression. Lucas, unfazed, smiled gently. "I remember what you like," he said simply, as if that alone explained everything. "I thought it might make your day better." Evelyn rolled her eyes but didn't argue further. She was unaccustomed to kindness that wasn't transactional. She didn't want anyone, including him, interfering with her carefully constructed boundaries. Still, she caught herself looking at the chocolate box more than she intended, noting the subtle attention to detail, the care that had gone into remembering exactly what she liked. Over the next few days, Lucas continued to do small things. Not extravagant, not showy, but consistent. A coffee left on her desk during an early morning meeting, a handwritten note with encouragement after a particularly grueling client presentation, or a discreet smile when she passed him in the hallway. Each gesture chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. Evelyn didn't like it. She didn't need it. She reminded herself constantly that he was 26, an intern, a subordinate. But the more she told herself that, the more she noticed how her heart betrayed her. One evening, she stayed late in her office, reviewing reports for the quarterly board meeting. She heard a soft knock on the door and looked up to see Lucas standing there, holding nothing but a quiet presence and a shy smile. "I thought you might like a snack," he said, holding a small plate with the last of the chocolate truffles she had yet to touch. "Figured it might help with the long night." Evelyn stared at him, resisting the surge of warmth that ran through her at the sight. "Lucas," she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt, "I don't need this. I don't need anyone fussing over me." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply placed the plate on the side of her desk, nodded, and left, leaving her to the quiet hum of her office. And yet, when she finally allowed herself a single bite of the chocolate, she realized that she had been craving attention. Not just any attention, but the kind that made her feel seen, noticed, and alive, even if it came from someone young enough to be a child in the eyes of the world. That night, Evelyn Rowe lay awake longer than usual. She didn't want to admit it. She didn't want to allow herself to feel the stirrings of desire, curiosity, or whatever it was Lucas had awakened inside her. She told herself it was temporary. It was foolish. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't stop thinking about the intern who dared to smile at her, remember her favorite chocolates, and make her feel something she had long convinced herself was no longer possible. For the first time in years, Evelyn Rowe realized she had stopped expecting more. And for the first time in years, she wondered if more might still find her, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Evelyn Rowe had spent decades perfecting control. Every meeting, every conversation, every gesture was measured, calculated, precise. She prided herself on it. That was why she was unsettled by Lucas Whitman. He didn't just work under her, he observed her. Not in a prying way, not to manipulate, but with a focus that felt personal. He remembered small details, how she liked her coffee, the slight crease in her brow when she was stressed, the way she rested her hand on her desk when she was deep in thought. At first, Evelyn ignored it, told herself it was professional courtesy. But the truth was harder to deny. His attention felt different. It started subtly. During morning briefings, he would look at her, not with hunger, not with awe, but with interest. He noticed things about her she didn't expect anyone to notice. A faint scar on her wrist, the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking, or how she tapped her pen when a problem frustrated her. He remembered these things. And sometimes, without realizing it, Evelyn caught herself unconsciously adjusting her posture, noticing him noticing her. Lucas's gestures were always small, thoughtful, and deliberate. A fresh notebook left on her desk when she mentioned her preference for a particular paper brand. A cup of tea delivered without her asking. A casual remark that acknowledged a project she was quietly proud of, rather than the ones that had made headlines. Each act was subtle, each glance intentional, and each moment seemed to linger just long enough to unsettle her. Evelyn hated it. She hated the way her pulse would quicken when he smiled, or the way she found herself replaying his questions and comments in her mind long after he left the room. She told herself repeatedly, "He's an intern, he's young. He doesn't know the world you've built. He can't understand the weight you carry." And yet, she also realized that he did. Somehow, Lucas seemed to understand her without needing explanations. He listened without judgment. He spoke without pretense. He looked at her like she was more than a title or a reputation. One afternoon, he left something new on her desk, a small envelope. Inside, a note: "You deserve a break. Even CEOs need to breathe. Take a moment today. Lucas." Evelyn stared at it, annoyed and flustered all at once. She didn't need reminders. She didn't need anyone telling her how to live her life. And yet, something about the gesture tugged at her. She found herself smiling briefly before carefully hiding the note in her drawer. Later, during a team meeting, Evelyn noticed Lucas watching her. She felt a faint heat rise in her chest, a warmth that wasn't professional, wasn't appropriate, and yet wasn't unwelcome. He caught her eye and held it for a heartbeat longer than necessary. A shiver ran down her spine. She quickly looked away, telling herself it was a trick of lighting or fatigue, but deep down she knew it was. It wasn't just the gestures, it was the intent behind them. Lucas didn't perform for her. He didn't try to impress. He simply acted in ways that reminded her of what it felt like to be human, to be wanted, to be noticed for more than efficiency and perfection. At the end of that week, she received another bouquet of peonies. This time, no chocolate, just flowers with a note. For the hardest working woman I know. You don't get told often enough that people notice you, Evelyn. She almost didn't see the note. She almost dismissed it. Almost. But then she remembered how small things like this used to matter to her when she was younger, when life felt less rigid and more alive. The memory made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in decades. She shoved the bouquet to the side, telling herself firmly, I don't need this. I don't need him. And yet she did. That night, Evelyn stayed at the office longer than usual, pretending to work but unable to focus. She found herself replaying the moments of the day, Lucas's soft smile, the curve of his lips when he spoke earnestly, the way he had tilted his head when she explained a project's complexities. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that it was fleeting, that he was young, inexperienced, and bound to move on. But every time she tried to push the thoughts away, they returned stronger. The tension between them was no longer just professional. It was electric, undeniable. She caught herself imagining what it might feel like to lean just a little closer when he spoke, to brush her hand against his deliberately, to let herself be seen without restraint. And that was the problem. Evelyn Rowe, billionaire, powerhouse, untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. Vulnerable to a 26-year-old intern who had, with nothing more than attention, chocolates, and subtle gestures, started to break through the walls she had spent a lifetime building. She hated that he had this effect on her. She hated that she wanted it. And yet a part of her could not resist thinking, imagining, yearning. For the first time in years, Evelyn realized that the attention she had always ignored, dismissed as trivial, unnecessary, or distracting, felt essential. Not indulgent, not foolish, but alive. Lucas Whitman had not done anything drastic. He had not overstepped boundaries. He had not declared his feelings, and yet he had won a space in her mind, a corner of her heart she didn't even realize she had left unlocked. Evelyn told herself that it was temporary, that she would regain her composure, her control, and her professionalism. But as she closed her laptop that evening, staring out at the city lights from her modest office window, she knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Lucas Whitman's attention had started to feel different, and she didn't want it to stop. Evelyn Rowe had been telling herself for weeks that Lucas Whitman was just an intern, a bright, capable, unusually observant intern, someone who needed guidance, someone she could train and evaluate. That's all. But by the third week, the boundaries she had so carefully drawn were beginning to blur. Lucas had a way of showing up at the right moments, not intrusively, but at exactly the time she needed him. A report she thought she'd misplaced was suddenly on her desk, neatly organized. A note of encouragement when she felt drained after a difficult phone call. And small gifts, dark chocolate, white peonies, even a coffee delivered just the way she liked it, all without asking, all done with quiet precision. Evelyn hated that she noticed, hated that she anticipated them. She was a woman who had built an empire on control, yet Lucas was slowly teaching her how it felt to lose a bit of that control, not in a reckless way, but in the most deliberate, maddeningly effective way imaginable. It was late one Friday afternoon when it happened. Evelyn had stayed behind to review financial projections for a meeting that had been rescheduled. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of her computer. She was alone, save for the occasional janitorial staff tidying the hallway outside. She was focused, immersed in numbers and graphs, when she sensed a presence behind her. "Still here," Lucas's voice was soft, low, casual, but it carried weight she felt in her chest. She didn't look up immediately. "Yes," she replied tersely, trying to sound professional. "I wanted to finish before the weekend." Lucas stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, his hands empty, his eyes warm. "I thought I'd bring something for you." He placed a small plate on her desk, A single chocolate truffle, dark, smooth, exactly the one she liked, beside a tiny note. For a moment of peace. You deserve it. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Lucas, she said, firm but not unkind, you don't have to do this. He didn't smile, not yet. Instead, he crouched slightly so he was at her eye level, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. I know, he said quietly, but I wanted to. The simple honesty of it hit her harder than she expected. She felt her chest tighten, her body alert in a way it hadn't been in years. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time noticed details she hadn't before. The way his eyes held steady, the small curve of his jaw, the way he breathed calmly, intentionally, as if he belonged there. Evelyn wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to hide behind her professionalism, her age, her experience. Lucas, she said again, softer this time, I don't need. But he interrupted gently, leaning just a fraction closer. You do need it, you just don't realize it yet. And somehow he was right. The tension that had been simmering for weeks, the anticipation, the subtle touches, the careful attention, coalesced into something tangible. Evelyn felt her body respond before her mind could even argue. A warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years spread through her chest, down her arms, making her acutely aware of the fine line between control and surrender. Lucas extended a hand, not to touch her forcefully, but in the kind of gesture that invited, not demanded. May I? He asked, nodding toward the chocolate on the plate. Evelyn hesitated. The rational part of her mind screamed no, reminded her of the age difference, the professional boundaries, the consequences. But the other part, the part that had been quietly starved of attention and care, whispered yes. She nodded almost imperceptibly. He handed her the truffle. Their fingers brushed. Just briefly, just lightly, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt through her, enough to make her inhale sharply, enough to make her aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched her without expectation, without power play, without calculation. For a moment, Evelyn simply held the chocolate, looked at Lucas, and allowed herself to acknowledge the stirring inside her. She felt dizzy, embarrassed, and alive all at once. And Lucas didn't rush her. He didn't speak. He just waited, patient, attentive, letting her feel the moment entirely. Then, almost casually, he said, You deserve this, Evelyn, more than you think. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't lustful in a crass way. It was intention, care, recognition. And for the first time in decades, Evelyn Rowe allowed herself to feel it fully. She didn't smile. She didn't speak for several seconds, lost in a whirl of emotions she hadn't expected. But when she finally exhaled, it wasn't relief. It was realization. She had been building walls, guarding herself from the world, and Lucas had found a way past them. Not by force, not by seduction, but by seeing her as she was, complex, flawed, human, and deserving of attention. That single, quiet interaction, hands brushing, chocolate shared, presence felt, shifted everything. The careful, controlled Evelyn Rowe, who thought she no longer desired closeness, realized that she wanted it, desired it, craved it. And for the first time, she knew that Lucas Whitman wasn't just an intern in her company. He was someone who had begun to occupy space in her mind, her chest, and her body in ways she couldn't yet name, and she was powerless to stop it. The office lights hummed quietly overhead, the city outside dimming into early evening. Evelyn sat frozen, chocolate half consumed, heart racing, awareness heightened. A thought flitted through her mind, stubborn and impossible to suppress. I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I can't deny I want it. And in that moment, Lucas Whitman didn't just cross a boundary, he erased it. Evelyn Rowe had always been meticulous. She planned her life, her business, her interactions down to the finest detail. Nothing was left to chance. Yet with Lucas Whitman, the meticulous Evelyn found herself off balance. Every small gesture he made, every note, every glance, every chocolate truffle, seemed to chip away at the walls she had spent decades building. It wasn't that she hadn't felt attraction before. She had. Men had tried, courted, flattered, and occasionally seduced her, but it was always different. Those men were predictable, safe, or merely interested in what she could provide. They never looked at her as she really was, complex, flawed, tired, yet vibrant in ways only she knew. Lucas Whitman, 26 and inexperienced in the ways of the world, had done something no one else ever had. He had made her feel alive, noticed, wanted, without demanding anything in return. And that terrified her. She had kept their interactions strictly professional during the day. At work, she was the CEO, commanding every meeting, making every decision, issuing directives without hesitation. Yet even in the structured environment of the office, she found herself aware of him in ways that made her pulse quicken. A simple smile across the room, a thoughtful glance at her reaction during a discussion, the subtle way he remembered small details she hadn't expected him to notice. It was maddening. She hated that she thought about him constantly. She hated that she lingered over the note he left on her desk. "You deserve a moment to breathe. Even the strongest need it." She hated that when she read it, her body responded before her mind could. The tightening of her chest, the warmth that spread down her arms, the sudden awareness of his nearness, all of it made her feel foolish. Yet despite the irrationality of it, Evelyn could not deny the pull she felt toward him. The pull that insisted he was more than just an intern. That insisted the way her thoughts lingered on him was not merely curiosity or novelty, but desire. But she refused to name it. Refusing gave her a sense of control. If she didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't complicate her life. It couldn't embarrass her. It couldn't undo the careful balance she had maintained for decades. She told herself she was too old, too powerful, too self-contained to be swept off her feet by a 26-year-old intern. She reminded herself that he didn't even belong to her world. He was still learning, still growing, still inexperienced in ways that made her feel protective and, annoyingly, restless at the same time. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to her restraint, or perhaps he simply respected it, knowing when to push and when to step back. He continued his gestures of attention, small, deliberate, unobtrusive. A perfectly timed coffee when she was buried in reports, a single chocolate on a Friday afternoon, notes reminding her to take care of herself, to breathe, to remember she wasn't invincible. One Wednesday, as Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, she found herself staring at Lucas across the room. He was talking with another intern, animated and expressive, yet she could feel his gaze finding hers without even looking directly. That subtle connection, the awareness that he saw her, even when she didn't want him to, sent a shiver through her. Her rational mind screamed for her to stop, to focus, to maintain decorum. But the rest of her, the part she had long suppressed, yearned for it, yearned for him. The awareness of desire, even if she refused to name it, gnawed at her. Every smile, every gentle touch of his hand when passing documents, every glance lingered just long enough to remind her of what she wanted but dared not admit. She caught herself fantasizing, in moments she thought private, about the idea of being close to him. Not just proximity, but connection. Not just physical, but emotional. What it would feel like to have someone look at her the way he did, without pretense, without agenda. And the worst part, she knew she could never allow herself to be fully honest about it. Not at the office. Not to herself in front of her peers. Not even in front of Lucas yet. To acknowledge it would mean vulnerability, exposure, admitting that this young man had a power over her she hadn't felt in decades. But he did. She noticed it in the smallest things. How her chest would tighten when he laughed at something she said, how her mind would linger on the sound of his voice, how her stomach would flutter when he passed by unexpectedly. These sensations were foreign, unwelcome, and intoxicating all at once. One late afternoon, as Evelyn sorted through project updates, she noticed a small box at the edge of her desk. Another truffle, another note. For a moment to yourself, you deserve it. Her first instinct was irritation. Her second was defensiveness. Her third, and most dangerous, was curiosity. She reached for it, hand trembling slightly, and paused, realizing that this was the first time in years she had allowed herself to desire something without immediately controlling or dismissing it. She bit the chocolate slowly, deliberately. And in that moment she felt it, the awareness that Lucas Whitman had begun to occupy space in her life she didn't want to admit existed. The awareness that he had begun to touch her, emotionally, sensually, intimately, without a single inappropriate action, a single overstep, a single word of seduction. He had only been himself, and yet that was enough to awaken something she had long tried to suppress. Evelyn Rowe, the woman who had long refused to expect more, realized that the desire she refused to name was real, that it was powerful, that it was hers, whether she allowed it or not. And she knew, deep down, that she was powerless to stop it from growing. For the first time in decades, she wondered, could she let herself feel it? Could she let herself want him without fear, without shame, without pretense? She didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to, because the truth lingered in the air, heavy, undeniable, and electric. Evelyn Rowe's carefully controlled life had begun to bend under the weight of a 26-year-old intern's attention, and she could not stop it from happening. Evelyn Rowe had tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. She had told herself that Lucas Whitman was just an intern, that his attentions were harmless, and that her growing awareness of him was irrelevant. Yet the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It started subtly, a raised eyebrow from a colleague as she passed through the office, a small knowing smirk from someone in HR. Then the whispers, not malicious at first, just curiosity, but curiosity has a way of growing teeth. Soon the office air seemed charged, every glance at her accompanied by silent speculation. What's going on between the CEO and the intern? Evelyn felt exposed, vulnerable. A flush rose to her cheeks more than once as she navigated the hallways, aware that Lucas's presence only made the whispers louder. He wasn't the kind of man to hide, but he also didn't flaunt his connection with her. Still, everyone could feel the pull between them, subtle but undeniable. One afternoon, she entered the conference room for a strategy session, only to notice the quiet shifting of chairs, a sudden hush, and then the barely restrained smirks of her team. Lucas was already there, sitting at the edge of the table, papers neatly stacked, eyes on her as if she were the only thing that mattered in the room. The whispers didn't escape him, he noticed. He didn't deny it. Instead, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, a look that said, "I know what you're feeling, I don't care, and I'm here anyway." Evelyn wanted to disappear under the table. She wanted to scold herself for allowing a 26-year-old to make her feel this way. She wanted to reclaim her composure, remind everyone that she was the CEO and he was, despite the attraction, an intern. Yet, even as she reminded herself of the boundaries, she felt her body betray her. Her stomach fluttered. Her chest tightened. Her mind replayed the brush of his fingers on the chocolate box days earlier, the way he had leaned just slightly closer when handing her coffee. It wasn't fair. Not to her, not to anyone who had invested years in watching her maintain control. And yet, Lucas Whitman had entered her life like a slow, insistent tide, eroding her walls with gentle waves of attention and care. That evening she retreated to her office, alone, hopping to process her thoughts. But Lucas wasn't done. He knocked softly and entered, holding a single flower in his hand this time, a simple white peony. "I thought you might like this," he said casually, placing it on her desk. "No chocolate today, just the flower and the weight of his gaze." Evelyn sighed, feeling both irritation and longing. "Lucas," she said firmly, "you don't have to keep doing this." He didn't look hurt, he didn't protest. Instead, he stepped closer just enough that the air between them seemed to shimmer. "I know," he said softly. "But I want to." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tension, the pull, the unspoken acknowledgement of desire hung in the room like a tangible thing. People are noticing, Evelyn said finally, her voice low, almost a whisper. They're talking. Lucas leaned casually against the edge of her desk, still respectful of her space. Let them talk, he said. It doesn't matter what they think, it's us that counts. Her stomach twisted. That simple sentence, so confident, so unwavering, made her heart race. Her mind screamed caution. Her body screamed curiosity. Her soul, the part she rarely admitted existed, screamed for more. Evelyn realized that she had been protecting herself for so long, hiding her feelings, controlling her interactions, maintaining a professional distance, only to find that she could no longer hide from herself. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle observation from the people around her forced her to confront what she had been denying. Lucas Whitman made her feel things she had convinced herself she was done feeling. Desire, excitement, want. She was ashamed to admit it, even to herself. The age difference, the scrutiny, the judgment, it all made her heart pound in secret. Yet, despite the shame, she found herself longing for him in ways she had forgotten existed. She thought about the way he looked at her when she entered the room, the careful attention he paid to her preferences, the patient persistence of his gestures. That night she lay awake in her apartment, the quiet hum of the city below her window, replaying the day. She thought of the whispers, the stares, the subtle smirks of her colleagues. And she thought of Lucas, sitting across the table, fearless, unapologetic, entirely unshaken by the world around him. Evelyn realized something terrifying and exhilarating. She wanted him. She wanted him despite the world, despite her age, despite the judgment. She wanted him because he made her feel seen, wanted, and alive in a way she had long convinced herself was impossible. And in that realization she felt the first real crack in her armor. She could continue pretending. She could continue to hide her feelings. She could maintain appearances. But the truth, stubborn and undeniable, was now part of her. Evelyn Rowe, the woman who had stopped expecting more, was falling under the spell of a 26-year-old intern, and she could no longer deny it. Lucas Whitman had become more than attention, more than flirtation, more than distraction. He had become the center of her unspoken desire, the source of tension she could no longer ignore. And the whispers around them, once a source of discomfort, now only highlighted what she had long tried to deny. Desire doesn't care about age, status, or propriety. Desire simply is. And Evelyn Rowe had no choice but to face it. Evelyn Rowe had always been impervious to gossip. She had weathered boardroom betrayals, hostile takeovers, and public scrutiny over business decisions that would have ruined lesser executives. But the whispers about her and Lucas Whitman were different. They weren't about profit margins or quarterly losses. They weren't about mergers or acquisitions. They were about her heart, or at least what people assumed it might be doing. And that made her uneasy in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started with a casual comment from a colleague during a meeting. "Have you noticed how close you and Lucas are lately?" The remark was casual, almost teasing, but Evelyn felt it like a blade. She glanced at Lucas across the room. His expression was neutral, professional, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, the same intensity she had been avoiding acknowledging in herself. She cleared her throat and moved the conversation back to the agenda, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The murmurs grew louder, subtle yet constant. The receptionist whispered about seeing them in the elevator together. HR speculated about the new dynamic between the CEO and the intern. Even her closest executive assistants began to exchange glances when Lucas entered the room. Evelyn hated it, hated the attention, hated the whispers, hated the way her chest tightened at every sideways glance, every snicker, every subtle judgment. Yet beneath the irritation and the fear there was a thrill she could not deny. The pressure reminded her that what she felt, what she wanted, was alive, undeniable, and visible. And Lucas, he didn't falter, he didn't hide, he didn't apologize, he simply remained himself, attentive, confident, patient. Every time a whisper or glance threatened to shake her, he steadied her with a small smile, a gentle nod, a hand that lingered just long enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. One evening, Evelyn was reviewing reports late in her office when her closest friend called. "Evelyn, are you sure this is a good idea?" her friend asked cautiously. "He's young and well, people are talking." Evelyn sighed, massaging her temples. "I know," she admitted. "I don't care what they say, really. I can't help how I feel." Her friend's voice softened, tinged with worry. "Just be careful. You're strong, but emotions can get messy, even for you." Evelyn hung up, staring at her reflection in the office window. She felt torn between two forces, the desire Lucas stirred in her and the expectations of the world. She wanted him. She craved his attention, his presence, his touch. And yet she feared the judgment, the scandal, the exposure. Lucas, sensing her unease without being intrusive, left another note on her desk. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I care about you. Always." The simplicity of the words made her heart ache. She wanted to resist. She wanted to scold him, tell him this was impossible, that the world wouldn't understand. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Board members noticed the subtle chemistry between them during strategy sessions. Colleagues speculated. Even the media, always hungry for a story, began to notice the unusually young intern who seemed to command attention from the CEO in ways no one expected. Evelyn felt the walls of her carefully controlled life begin to shake. She tried to maintain distance, to assert boundaries, but every time she did, Lucas found a way to remind her, without words, without demands, that he was there, that he cared, that he wanted her. One night, after a particularly stressful day filled with whispers and judging eyes, Evelyn remained in her office long after everyone had left. Lucas appeared quietly, as always, carrying a small tray, a cup of tea, a piece of chocolate, and a single white peony. "I thought you could use this," he said softly. Evelyn looked at him, her resolve faltering. "Lucas, you shouldn't." He smiled faintly, almost playfully, but the warmth in his gaze grounded her. "I know, but I want to, and you deserve it." She took the chocolate and the tea, and for a moment simply sat in silence, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. She realized something she hadn't admitted aloud. The world could whisper, judge, and speculate all it wanted, but she didn't care anymore. Not about them, not about what was appropriate. Her desire for Lucas had grown too strong, too insistent to be ignored. And yet, the shame lingered. She hated that it was easier to let the world see the whispers than to admit her longing aloud. She hated the vulnerability it required. She hated that her body, her mind, her heart were all betraying her self-control. Lucas, patient as ever, simply remained near her, offering what she needed most: presence, attention, and the gentle knowledge that she could surrender if she chose to. That night, as the city lights blinked below her window, Evelyn sat alone with her thoughts. The pressure from every side, the whispers, the judgment, the expectations, had not broken her. Instead, it had forced her to confront a truth she could no longer deny. She wanted him. She needed him. And nothing, not age, not reputation, not whispers, could change that. The world could talk. The world could speculate. The world could try to pull them apart. But Lucas Whitman had become her choice, and for the first time in decades, Evelyn Rowe was ready to fight for what she wanted. The pressure from every side had done what she never expected. It had clarified her desire. And it had made her want him even more. Evelyn Rowe had spent decades building a life she could control. Every detail, every decision, every move, every relationship was calculated. She had assumed she knew exactly what she wanted: respect, independence, and the unshakable assurance that no one could ever manipulate or hurt her. And then Lucas Whitman arrived. He had not broken her, not exactly, but he had opened cracks she hadn't realized existed, cracks she had carefully plastered over with work, ambition, and discipline. She had told herself repeatedly that he was just an intern, that his attention was harmless, even charming, but ultimately irrelevant. That had been a lie. The realization hit her fully one evening as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her thoughts replayed the events of the past few weeks, the chocolates left on her desk, the gentle notes, the way he looked at her during meetings, the subtle brushes of proximity that left her heart racing. For the first time in decades, Evelyn understood what she had been missing. Not just physical attention, not just emotional support, but the rare, intoxicating combination of both. Someone who could see her entirely, even the parts she didn't show to the world, and still want her. She had nearly lost herself in the illusion of control, nearly dismissed the feeling as fleeting curiosity. But now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, she understood the gravity of it. Lucas Whitman was already in her life, and she had no intention of letting him go. Her mind wandered to the office that morning. She had noticed subtle signs, whispers of colleagues, curious glances, the way HR seemed unusually attentive when Lucas entered a room. But what really struck her was the realization that the world didn't matter. The opinions, the gossip, the judgment, none of it could erase what Lucas had done. He had made her feel desired, alive, and seen. And that realization came with fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of continuing to resist. Fear that her shame, her pride, or her insistence on control might push him away before she even allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she wanted. She thought back to a simple moment in the office. Lucas had handed her a cup of tea one late afternoon, leaning just slightly closer than necessary, his warm eyes locking onto hers. That single, gentle gesture had sent a pulse of electricity through her entire body, and she had barely noticed it at first. But in hindsight, she recognized it as a turning point, a subtle, deliberate step into her heart and her desires. Evelyn knew now that she had almost lost herself to fear. She had almost let rationality, societal expectation, and personal pride keep her from embracing what she truly wanted. And yet, paradoxically, it was fear itself that revealed the depth of her feelings. She didn't just like Lucas Whitman. She didn't just enjoy his company. She needed him in ways she had long suppressed and denied. That night she found herself reviewing the small notes he had left her. Each one was a careful blend of attentiveness and subtlety, each one acknowledging her humanity, her exhaustion, her unspoken needs. And she realized something critical. She hadn't just lost attention or opportunity. She had lost the courage to feel alive in years, and Lucas had given it back to her without even trying. The thought made her pulse quicken. She knew she had a choice to make. Continue pretending, maintaining her strict boundaries and risking the slow erosion of her desire, or allow herself to embrace the connection she had been denying, despite the judgment, despite the age difference, despite the risk. She wasn't ready to fully surrender yet. She wasn't ready to admit aloud the desires that had been building inside her, desires that whispered in quiet moments and demanded attention in ways that were impossible to ignore. But she was closer than ever. The next morning she arrived at the office with a new awareness. Lucas was already there, reviewing documents, his expression focused. But as soon as he noticed her, a small smile tugged at his lips, the same smile that had started this slow unraveling of her carefully constructed life. Evelyn's chest tightened. She wanted to scold him for the way he made her feel. She wanted to demand that he respect her professional space. And yet, a part of her, a part she had almost forgotten existed, wanted to throw caution to the wind, to lean just a little closer, to let him see the truth of what he had awakened in her. She caught herself imagining it, the warmth of his hands, the way he would look at her, the soft curve of his lips against hers. And she realized that this was not just desire. This was longing, urgent, undeniable, and entirely hers. The realization hit her with both fear and exhilaration. If she didn't act soon, if she didn't allow herself to feel, to acknowledge, to embrace Lucas fully, she might lose him. Not because he wanted to leave, but because she had built walls so high that even he might be kept at bay. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Rowe understood that desire wasn't weakness, and that vulnerability wasn't failure. She understood that in order to keep what she wanted most, she would have to risk everything she had spent decades protecting. And she was ready, because Lucas Whitman had given her something she hadn't realized she had lost: the courage to feel, the courage to want, and the courage to finally, unapologetically, embrace her own desires. Evelyn Rowe had spent years constructing a life of control, precision, and emotional armor. Every interaction was calculated, every relationship carefully measured. Comfort had been her guiding principle: comfort in solitude, comfort in authority, comfort in maintaining a distance from anything that might disrupt her carefully balanced world. Until Lucas Whitman. It wasn't just that he had captured her attention or stirred desire she hadn't felt in decades. It was that he had taught her something she had almost forgotten: honesty with herself, embracing desire, acknowledging vulnerability, letting herself feel fully, was far more liberating than comfort ever was. The moment of truth came unexpectedly, one Friday afternoon. The office was quieter than usual. Most of the staff had left early. Evelyn sat at her desk, reviewing reports, her thoughts wandering back to the last few weeks: the chocolates, the notes, the subtle glances, the way Lucas seemed to exist in her world naturally, confidently, unapologetically. She realized she had been avoiding him all day, maintaining a professional distance, and yet every fiber of her being ached for him. The restraint she had clung to was suddenly heavier than any discomfort she had ever tolerated. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she said, her voice slightly tighter than she intended. Lucas stepped in, his presence immediately filling the room. He carried nothing this time: not chocolates, not flowers, not notes. Just himself, calm, confident, and aware of her tension. "I thought I'd see how my favorite CEO is doing," he said lightly, but his eyes were steady on her, warm, unflinching. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, a blush creeping across her cheeks. "Lucas," she began, almost faltering. The truth she had been holding back for weeks surged forward, impossible to ignore. He stepped closer, just enough that she felt the subtle warmth radiating from him. "You've been avoiding me today," he said, his voice gentle but pointed. "Why?" She hesitated. She wanted to retreat into comfort, to give a polite, professional explanation. But the longing, the tension, the raw desire she had suppressed finally outweighed her usual caution. "Because she started, then stopped, realizing she couldn't finish the sentence without admitting something she had denied to herself for too long. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "Because I want this," she confessed, her voice low, deliberate. "I want you, and I've been pretending I don't." Lucas's expression softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Then don't pretend anymore," he said simply. Evelyn's pulse raced. The words she had longed to hear, yet feared to speak, were now in the open. The air between them vibrated with anticipation, a charged energy neither could ignore. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, not forcefully but with an intimacy that sent shivers up her spine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself linger in the touch, acknowledging the desire she had been suppressing. "Lucas," she whispered, almost a plea, "it's complicated." "I know," he replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "But the truth is always worth it, and I don't want anything else but the truth with you." The honesty in his words shattered the last remnants of resistance within her. Evelyn Rowe, billionaire, CEO, untouchable, felt something rare and dangerous: release. She leaned slightly closer, closing the gap between them, and for the first time allowed herself to feel without restraint. Their hands intertwined, a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of unspoken promises, long-held desires, and the acknowledgement of the attraction that had been simmering for weeks. Evelyn realized that this moment, this simple act of honesty, was more intoxicating than any control, more thrilling than any strategic victory she had ever achieved in the boardroom. "Lucas," she said again, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. "I've been afraid of what this means, of what people might say, of me feeling this way." He tilted his head, his eyes locking onto hers. "Evelyn, desire isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace, and I'll wait for you as long as it takes, but I'm not going anywhere." Her heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to insist on caution, but she found herself shaking her head, letting go of the weight of restraint for the first time. The fear of judgment, the pressure of whispers, the age difference, they all faded in comparison to the raw, undeniable truth between them. And then slowly, deliberately, she leaned closer. Just a small movement, barely perceptible, yet it marked the first surrender. Lucas responded instantly, not rushing, not pushing, but closing the space with the same careful attention and respect that had defined him since the beginning. Evelyn felt the electricity in the room intensify. Her body responded to his presence, to the heat of proximity, to the acknowledgement of her own longing. She realized she had been chasing control for too long, that comfort had been a cage. And now, honesty, painful, terrifying, liberating honesty, was the key to freedom. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in the charged silence, hands entwined, hearts racing, the unspoken understanding clear. Nothing would be the same again. Evelyn Rowe, the woman who had spent a lifetime hiding behind walls, had chosen honesty over comfort. And in that choice, she found a satisfaction far deeper than any success she had achieved in the boardroom. For the first time in decades, she felt truly alive. Evelyn Rowe had spent a lifetime in control. Every aspect of her world, her career, her decisions, her image, was meticulously curated. Public perception was something she valued almost as much as her own sense of power. But Lucas Whitman had shown her that some things were more important than control. Some things, like desire, connection, and truth, could not be hidden forever. It had begun subtly. A brush of hands in the hallway, a shared smile during meetings, small gestures that were visible enough for others to notice, but private enough to keep judgment at bay. Yet with each passing day, Evelyn found herself wanting more, wanting to let the world see what had already claimed her heart. The tipping point came at a company celebration. It wasn't a lavish gala, just a modest gathering for a successful quarter, but Evelyn knew her colleagues' eyes would be attentive. She had spent weeks rehearsing her demeanor, reminding herself to maintain composure, to separate professionalism from private desire. But Lucas had other ideas. He appeared by her side, calm and confident, as though he had always belonged there. Evelyn felt the familiar flutter in her chest, the mix of desire, anticipation, and just a hint of fear. She noticed the whispers immediately, the subtle glances, the half-smiles of curiosity, the speculative murmurs among her team. She had anticipated judgment, but she hadn't anticipated how freeing it would feel to step into it willingly. Lucas leaned slightly closer as they mingled, his hand brushing hers in a deliberate, intimate gesture. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It was proud, unapologetic, and affectionate. Evelyn felt the heat rise in her chest, not from shame but from exhilaration. This was her choice, and it was thrilling to finally own it. "Everyone's starring," she whispered, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "I know," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And I don't care. You don't have to hide who you are or who we are." She wanted to protest, to retreat, but instead she felt a rush of courage. She realized that the whispers, the stares, the judgment, they were meaningless compared to the satisfaction of honestly existing in the same space as him, without apology. By the end of the evening, she had made a decision. She no longer wanted to retreat. She no longer wanted to pretend their connection was just professional or casual. Lucas had shown her the power of presence, intention, and honesty, and she would honor it by allowing the world, even her colleagues, to see it. It started small. A subtle touch on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, a brief interlocking of fingers as they laughed at a joke, a shared glance that lingered just a fraction too long for anyone else to ignore. and slowly whispers began to circulate, not mocking, not malicious, but acknowledging there is something between them. Evelyn felt a thrill at the realization. The age difference, the whispers, the scrutiny, it all existed, but it no longer mattered. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer ashamed. She chose honesty over comfort, and that choice gave her a power and sensuality she hadn't felt in decades. Later that evening, after the office had cleared, Lucas stayed behind with her. They were alone in the quiet of the building, the hum of the city outside their window. Evelyn turned to him, her chest still racing from the adrenaline of public acknowledgement. "You know," she said softly, "tonight, I felt alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I didn't care about the whispers, the judgment, or what anyone thinks. I just felt us." Lucas smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Good. That's all I want for you, to feel alive, to feel free, to feel desire without shame." Evelyn's pulse quickened as she realized the depth of his words. Desire, she now understood, was not a liability. Vulnerability was not weakness. And pleasure, physical, emotional, and sensual, was not something to hide but to embrace with courage and intention. She stepped closer, letting the heat of proximity, the lingering touch of his hand, and the quiet intensity of his gaze envelop her. Their lips met briefly, a gentle but charged kiss, tasting like chocolate, warmth, and the electricity of truth. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't careless. It was deliberate, sensual, and intimate, a reflection of the careful dance they had been performing for weeks. Evelyn felt herself surrendering not just to the kiss, but to the awareness that she had made a choice to be honest, to embrace desire, and to let the world see her connection with Lucas Whitman. She realized that nothing could take away what they shared unless she allowed it to. The whispers, the judgment, the skepticism, all of it was irrelevant compared to the intensity, passion, and authenticity of their bond. For the first time in decades, Evelyn Rowe walked confidently in the light of her own desires, unashamed, unapologetic, and fully alive. Lucas Whitman was no longer just an intern. He was her partner in something real, sensual, and profoundly transformative. And together, they had begun a journey that would challenge the world. But more importantly, it would satisfy the cravings of their hearts in ways neither of them had ever imagined. Evelyn Rowe had spent most of her life in control of her career, her decisions, her image, her desires. She had always measured every interaction, calculated every step, and ensured that her emotions never overpowered her judgment. She had told herself that this meticulous control was a shield, a necessity in a world that demanded strength from her at every turn. And then Lucas Whitman had arrived. He was 26, young, energetic, unassuming in the ways that mattered most, yet bold in ways that challenged everything Evelyn thought she knew about herself. He had not barged into her life demanding attention or affection. He had simply existed, with quiet confidence, gentle persistence, and an uncanny ability to see her, truly see her. And over time, Evelyn had discovered something she had long forgotten, that the world, with all its expectations, was irrelevant when desire, honesty, and love intersected. They had crossed the threshold from subtle glances and teasing touches to an intimacy that neither of them had rushed, yet both had anticipated with an urgency that made every heartbeat a drum of longing. Lucas had been patient, unflinching, understanding when she faltered, careful when she wavered, and unwavering in his attention. Evelyn had responded in kind, letting go of control, surrendering to desire, and discovering a satisfaction deeper than anything she had ever known. It began one quiet evening after the office had emptied. The hum of the city outside was the only sound, a soft backdrop to the charged air between them. Lucas approached her desk, his steps measured, eyes unwavering. Evelyn's pulse quickened, though she had long since stopped denying the effect he had on her. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "about everything, us. The judgment, the age difference, the fear, and I realized I don't care about any of it anymore." Lucas smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her chest ache. I don't want you to. He replied softly, I want us to be us, fully, completely, no half measures, no pretending, no holding back. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. The honesty in his words, the certainty, the patience, it was intoxicating. She stepped closer, closing the space between them, her body responding instinctively to his nearness. She felt the heat of anticipation, the flutter of longing, the undeniable pull that had grown between them for weeks, now ready to burst into something tangible. Lucas reached for her hand, intertwining fingers, his touch deliberate, grounding, intimate. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he murmured, leaning slightly closer. I'm here, completely. Evelyn let herself breathe, truly breathe, for the first time in years. Her walls, meticulously built over decades, had crumbled, not through force or coercion, but through patience, attention, and care. And now, in the quiet of the office, she allowed herself to be wholly present with him. Their lips met slowly, intentionally, the first kiss carrying the weight of weeks of anticipation, suppressed desire, and the raw honesty they had both been nurturing. Evelyn felt herself melt against him, her arms finding their way around his neck, her body responding to his warmth, his confidence, his attention. Lucas's hands traced the curve of her back, gentle yet insistent, guiding her into the realization that this was more than desire, it was fulfillment. Every touch, every glance, every soft whisper was a conversation, a promise, a declaration of connection. Evelyn, who had spent decades commanding boardrooms, negotiating deals, and maintaining appearances, felt something far more potent. She felt wanted, seen, and cherished in ways that transcended the physical. The kiss deepened, slow, sensual, and deliberate. Evelyn's senses sharpened, every nerve alive with the intensity of the moment. She let herself be vulnerable, let herself respond to the subtle guidance of his hands, the warmth of his chest against hers, the steady rhythm of his breath. It was a different kind of satisfaction, not the fleeting thrill of conquest, but the profound pleasure of mutual desire and trust. They broke apart briefly, foreheads resting together, breathing in sync. Evelyn looked into Lucas's eyes and saw reflection, desire, respect, adoration. It was a mirror of what she had been denying herself, the affirmation of everything she had felt but hadn't spoken. I've never felt anything like this, she admitted, her voice trembling with exhilaration. Not in decades. Lucas smiled, brushing his thumb across her cheek. You deserve it, he whispered. Every bit of it, and I'm not going anywhere. The hours slipped away as they explored each other's presence, not recklessly, but intentionally. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was measured by honesty and desire, the culmination of tension, anticipation, and mutual understanding. Evelyn felt herself surrender completely, experiencing a satisfaction that was as emotional as it was physical, a liberation that no boardroom victory or carefully controlled life had ever provided. By the end of the night, Evelyn understood the full truth. Lucas Whitman was not just a young intern who had stirred her heart. He was a partner, a companion, a mirror, and a source of uncharted pleasure and joy. And she, Evelyn Rowe, was no longer the woman who measured everything. She was alive, she was unashamed, and she was fulfilled in ways she had never thought possible. As they sat together, limbs intertwined, Evelyn allowed herself one final, quiet thought. This was a different kind of satisfaction, not something that could be quantified, controlled, or predicted. Something raw, deep, and entirely theirs. And for the first time in decades, she knew she would never trade it for comfort, control, or appearances again.